All right. Thanks a lot, Major Gruner, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am very happy to be talking with you today about my organization, Space Training and Readiness Command, and what we do as the newest of the three field commands that make up the bulk of the United States Space Force. Opening up with this slide, you can see the Starcom patch there represented on the slide as well as on my arm, and our patch gives us a lot of pride. To go into some of the heraldry behind it, to create the arrowhead, we borrowed from official Space Force emblems, including borrowing the Delta from the Space Force seal and the Star Polaris from the Space Force logo. The Delta evokes the early history of Air Force space innovation and the space community, and it also symbolizes change. Polaris symbolizes a guiding light as we defend the space domain. The handle of the bow that you see there is a lightning bolt, which is a homage to the Air Force Space Warfare Center, as well as the Space Innovation and Development Center. Our patch also features constellations that represent the Greek goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, with the Noctua constellation, the owl in the bottom left, representing wisdom in training, and the Sagitta constellation in the upper right, which represents Starcom's constant readiness. So our patch serves as a powerful symbol of Starcom's mission, building the readiness of our space warfighters so that they prevail in competition and conflict. And that, in fact, is Starcom's mission, to prepare the United States Space Force to prevail in competition and conflict through innovative education, training, doctrine, and test. And you'll see in a little bit here how we are structured to accomplish those things with each of our mission deltas. So we might be the newest of the three field commands. We're actually just behind Space Systems Command in our stand-up last August, but we are moving out on our mission with a sense of urgency. We stood up our fifth and final delta at the end of last September, and you'll see the constituent pieces that make up Starcom here down at the bottom. They represent the leading edge of our operational capability and the way that we are preparing Guardians and preparing capabilities and warfighting solutions for the rest of the Space Force and ultimately the joint and in many cases coalition military community. And so it's really important what our Guardians are doing to defend the United States national security and our way of life. And so that's why Starcom exists, to make sure that we are preparing them correctly and ensure that they are ready. I would note that the deltas are one of only 3 organizational layers in Starcom. As with the rest of the Space Force, we have consolidated and flattened the overall command structure from what we had in the Air Force. The Air Force has 5 primary echelons of command. You've got the major command level. Under that, the numbered Air Force. Below that, the wing, and then within wing organizations, groups, and then below that, squadrons. But we have collapsed it in the Space Force to only 3 primary organizational echelons here. And so we've got the field command level, the delta level, and the squadron level. Squadrons are similar to what they are in the Air Force. Deltas kind of combine a lot of those wing and group functions, and the field command takes on roles that were previously provided by both the MAGCOM and the numbered Air Force. In addition, you can see that we also have some special staff organizations, the so-called S staff, kind of a classic staff organization focused on different pieces of the mission, whether ops or planning or so on. And then up in the upper right there, you see TMO. This is something that is still being worked out and developed, but that is short for the Talent Management Office, or sometimes it may be referred to as the ETMO, the Enterprise Talent Management Office, which is going to be the Space Force's equivalent to the Air Force Personnel Center, insofar as we are figuring out how to integrate all of these best practices in obtaining the right people to become Guardians, and then helping them to achieve their goals and meet the needs of the Space Force throughout their careers, through assignments and promotions and all of the rest of the things that go into that. But I want to draw your attention to the deltas and each of their mission focuses. First of all, Delta 1's job is to do training. And you can see that they've got a number of different squadrons under them. There's the first Delta Operations Squadron, and each of the Deltas has its own operations squadron that help with kind of commander support staff types of tasks, making sure that the unit is well provided for and handling a lot of administrative matters. Delta One's focus is on training, and so they have organizations that span a lot of different locations. Of course, they are responsible for the primary initial space training over at Vandenberg Space Force Base, California, where I was formerly stationed. And they have the 533rd Training Squadron that is providing that initial space operations career field training to our new Guardian officer and enlisted members. We have the 319th Combat Training Squadron, which is actually here in Colorado Springs at Peterson Space Force Base. And then we have other entities that are out there at the weapons school and providing a higher level of combat training for some more advanced applications. Delta 10 deals with doctrine and wargaming. So they are helping to create Space Force doctrine publications that talk about how we organize and equip and actually manage our potential warfighting operations in the space domain. And another big part of what they do is conduct war games such as the Schriever war game, which has been going on for a couple of decades now, and tries to figure out innovative new concepts in realistic scenarios that are kind of future focused to determine how best we can interoperate with our allies, how best we can come up with organizational and potentially material solutions for how we would prevail in competition and conflict in the future. Delta 11 is the Range and Aggressor Delta, and this is located at Schriever Space Force Base. Delta 10 is currently located at the Air Force Academy up here in Colorado Springs as well. Delta 11 is really trying to provide a lot of the realistic training environments for the test and training activities that the other deltas are doing to take place in. And so they have aggressor squadrons, certainly the 527th Space Aggressor Squadron. It has a reserve partner unit, the 26th, that provide realistic enemy simulations for our test and training experiences. And then going along with that, we have currently the 25th Space Range Squadron that provides the environment for these test and training activities and aggressor activities to take place on, so that we have a safe and controlled way to practice with things like space electronic warfare and how we would fight through that. In addition, Delta 11 is looking at future concepts and how we might develop the range and aggressor capabilities to deal with orbital warfare and how we would actually be potentially maneuvering satellites and doing things in the space domain to make sure that our Guardians are trained and prepared and ready. Closely partnered with Delta 11 is Delta 12, also located out at Schriever Space Force Base, and their mission is test and evaluation, particularly operational test and evaluation. So test and evaluation is a process subject to Department of Operational Test and Evaluation oversight at the Pentagon, and the basic purpose is to make sure that any capabilities that we are going out and buying and developing are going to be operationally useful and suitable, so that not only do we make sure that we can define requirements and build or buy systems, and that's what Space Systems Command, our partner field command, is largely responsible for, as well as some other entities. We want to make sure that as those systems are being fielded, that we can run them through the test and evaluation process and make sure that they are suitable for the job. Not only that they meet the particular requirements that were predefined, but that we can have an effective operational use scenario and develop concepts of operations and so forth, so that when they are handed over and operationally accepted by Space Operations Command, by the warfighters, that they will meet their intended purpose and be operationally useful. And so we've got currently 4 squadrons that do test and evaluation. TES stands for Test and Evaluation Squadron. And they are responsible for things like command and control for 1 TES, orbital warfare for 3 TES, electronic warfare for 4 TES, and space domain awareness and missile warning types of activities for 17 TES. So a lot of different missions that these organizations are doing, all of them critical to preparing Guardians and preparing the United States to prevail in space. And then finally, we have Delta 13, which is focused on education and is currently temporarily located at Maxwell Air Force Base, where I was last assigned at the Air Force JAG School. It's also the home of Air University, and it is where Air Force Space Command originally began the Schriever Space Scholars Program, which is now becoming a part of the Space Force professional military education. And in addition to the activities that they've got going on there, we have the Vossler Space, essentially NCO Academy here at Peterson, as well as the National Security Space Institute, which largely operates at Peterson. And that's something that I have been privileged to be a part of because along with 319th Combat Training Squadron, NSSI puts out a lot of great courses to train our joint and in many cases coalition warfighters to make sure that they have an understanding of all that's going on in the space domain. And my piece of that is to teach about the international and domestic space law and policy and rules of engagement and things like that, that are going to affect how we conduct ourselves as warfighters in the space domain. We have been blessed to this point not to have a war that fully extends to space. We certainly make great use of our space capabilities in war, but they are becoming increasingly threatened by counter space capabilities that other countries are developing and potentially threatening to use against us at some point. And so we've got to be ready. We've got to be able to develop those capabilities and tactics, techniques, and procedures, and people who are smart and skilled and know their systems and know the environment and will be ready to operate and defend US interests in the space domain. So that is what we're doing here at Starcom and through all of our subordinate deltas and squadrons. I want to go a little bit further into details on each of these particular deltas and what they do. Highlight that Delta 1, represented here by one of the first Space Force basic military training flights down in San Antonio. Delta 1 provides digital and some practical training that replicates real space defense scenarios. So we train Guardians from basic training all the way up through advanced applications, such as exercises like Space Flag. And that's some of the other parts of the first full flight of Space Force trainees graduated on May 6, 2021. And we've been doing that initial accession pipeline training over at Lackland, but as the Space Force and Starcom and Delta 1 mature, that may be moving to another location at some point. Delta 1 is currently headquartered over at Vandenberg Space Force Base, California. And approximately 312 new Space Force accessions, people coming in directly to the pipeline, will graduate from basic military training this fiscal year. We are gearing up for the first all-Guardian basic military training flight, where all the instructors and all of the trainees will be soon to be Space Force members that are coming in. So that should be complete by late June of 2022 and bring in 72 members of the Space Force. Highlighting some of the activities of Delta 10 doing Doctrine and Wargaming. You see some of our Academy cadets who I believe at least one of has graduated into the Space Force now. Their mission is to produce high quality documents and establish methods for codifying tactics. So you can see actually before Starcom even stood up, we had the publication of our space capstone publication, Space Power there. And then we have a number of other space doctrine publications that have been published already or are in the pipeline to define how we are going to continue operating in the space domain in the current and future environment in space. And we want to get these things out to the field fast, and but make sure that we do it right. So certainly at the legal offices, including ours, we've got the opportunity to coordinate and comment on those things and make sure that they are meeting all the legal requirements, as well as making sense from an operational standpoint in terms of how we do things in space. And then once we establish Doctrine, we also want to test it out in areas like the Schriever war game and coming future war games that Delta 10 is developing. The Schriever war game is the premier forum for joint international civil and commercial partners to explore new operating concepts that enhance stability and security in that contested, degraded, and operationally limited space domain that, that we now have. Right, moving on to recap some of the things about Delta 11. Delta 11 consists of elite range and aggressor personnel who are fortifying the combat capability of our nation's warfighters and warfighting capabilities. Delta 11 aims to keep the military, or the space domain free of military combat and conflict and preserved for the betterment of all humankind by building warfighting professionals and capabilities that are so combat credible that adversaries are deterred from initiating or extending a conflict into space, because they know with absolute certainty that their efforts will fail. So how does Delta 11 do that? Well, they deliver realistic, threat-informed test and training environments through the provision of live, virtual, and constructive range and combat replication capability in order to prepare the United States Space Force and designated joint and allied forces, where appropriate, to prevail in the space domain. Before we provide Guardians with new technologies and capabilities, we need to ensure that those tools are tested at the developmental level and at the operational level. And one thing that we are working on here in partnership with Space Systems Command and Space Operations Command is to provide an integrated test force and an integrated testing program so that we can really maximize efficiency in the test process. There is a piece of the test process known as developmental test and evaluation that is largely run through now Space Systems Command in our case, along with the contractors who may be developing certain systems. And then Starcom is providing the operational test and evaluation mission. And there are certain things involved in testing out systems that may have very important utility for both stages of that process. And so where we can overlap and combine efforts to the best extent possible while still maintaining an independent operational test capability that's not tied in with the contractor or the contracting offices that are buying the programs in the first place, we want to make sure that we are really maximizing efficiency so that we can get those new systems to the warfighter as soon as feasible and make sure that it is all checked out and ready to go and going to be useful and effective in its operational case. And so Delta 12 is the first place that we turn in order to make readiness decisions about space capabilities, to make sure that we are testing things and that they are passing the tests, and then that they're ready for full operational acceptance. And finally, back to Delta 13, our education mission. 13 is laser focused on setting up the processes, curriculum, and institutions that the Space Force needs to develop our Guardians from cradle to grave. They're building independent developmental education at the intermediate and senior levels for officers, and further enlisted developmental education through the establishment of the Enlisted Center of Excellence. So where the Department of the Air Force has historically conducted a professional military education through Air University at Maxwell, we've got things that are kind of starting off there for the Space Force PME, but we are rapidly trying to build out our own separate professional military education system. And one of the ways that we are trying to do that is through a coming university partnership program where ultimately we are seeking a Guardian education candidate school, an existing university with the right capabilities in place to be able to grant professional master's and potentially doctorate degrees to our Guardians who are going through their professional military education training, and to really make use of those resources efficiently, not by just having to create something from scratch and go all the way to build something new from the ground up, but to leverage those established capabilities that the civilian university has in order to partner with them, make sure that we're making good use of their research facilities, their faculty, and so on, as well as integrating our own there to provide the best possible training for our Space Force members, our guardians, as they are moving up through the ranks and developing increasing positions of responsibility. The final candidate for the university partner in this case has not been formally identified or announced, but people here are actively working through that process and trying to make sure that we get the right decisions made at the right level of responsibility and in accordance with all law and congressional notification requirements that might be required for a strategic basing action or any other type of activity that needs to happen to make this a reality. And hopefully, I know the goal has been to get this up and running by the next academic year. And part of Starcom's and Delta 13's mission in education is to develop institutional developmental education, develop U.S. Space Force officer accessions, it's certainly in partnership with the Talent Management Office process and with Delta 1's training, and to execute advanced education programs in order to prepare USSF forces and our designated joint and coalition partners to prevail in this contested, degraded, operationally limited space domain that is so integrated with our operations in the other domains. So that concludes the initial part, largely based on the Starcom command brief with some of my own additions in there. And I would like to point out, as we do with all of these public or potentially public types of applications and presentations, that things that I say here are my own views and do not necessarily represent the views of the Space Force, except to the extent they've been vetted through the mission briefing process. I just wanted to give you an overview of what Starcom is and what we're doing. A really neat thing about Starcom is that it is a new type of organization, whereas the other two field commands in the Space Force, Space Operations Command and Space Systems Command, had a big part of their legacy directly tied to prior Air Force space-related organizations. In Space Operations Command's case, the bulk of what was Air Force Space Command came to them. And then for Space Systems Command, they are largely built out of the old Space and Missile Systems Center down in Los Angeles, dealing with the acquisition mission. Of course, they also gained the two launch deltas out at Vandenberg and Patrick Space Force bases that previously had been under AFSpace and for an initial period under Space Operations Command. But Space Training and Readiness Command is something that is all new. It is analogous to and shares a lot of connective tissue with some other Air Force organizations, such as Air Education and Training Command, the U.S. Air Force Warfare Center, Air Force Operational Test and Evaluation Command, for example. But it's pulling these things all together in a new way to provide not only training, but also readiness. So we've got the training and education mission, we've got readiness that we provide through test and range and aggressors, and we're the Doctrine Center for the Space Force. So we're doing a lot of great things. There is still a lot of work to be done before we get to our full operational capability, as it were, and have the final look for what the Space Training and Readiness Command will be. There are still a number of future basing decisions, but just recently it was announced that we have some things in mind for future development and locations of different Starcom deltas and the headquarters itself. So with that, I want to thank you very much for listening to the presentation thus far, and then open up the remainder of our period for questions. So do we have any questions from chat or that people might like to just offer by unmuting themselves and speaking up on video?
Great, thank you so much, Brian. Really, really appreciate the presentation. As we wait for some comments to flow in through the chat, and attendees, please feel free to use either just the generic chat box or the Q&A box if you have any questions for Major Green. I wanted to open it up with a couple of questions from here. So one of the things that we talked about earlier on in the month, Brian, at the US Spacecom Legal Conference, obviously the theme of that conference was responsible behavior in outer space. So last year, Secretary of Defense Austin released his tenets of responsible behavior in outer space. How does Starcom go about, I guess, the process of educating or training our future guardians with respect to how best to actualize Secretary Austin's tenets of responsible behavior?
Thank you, Jeremy. We certainly do that through a lot of the training and education mission. We want to make sure that all of our training products, both the some of the legal briefings that I give, incorporate those tenets of responsible behavior directly. And I've got a slide with the memo and Secretary Austin's picture that I used to talk about those things. And so that is certainly something that we do, through the combat training squadrons, through the National Security Space Institute, in both Delta 1 and Delta 13. And we want to make sure that any sorts of test activities or things that we're doing on the range and what have you, new ways that we're testing out capabilities are also consistent with those tenets of responsible behavior, to make sure that as we are preparing to be ready to fight a war that may extend to the space domain, that we are doing so in a safe and responsible manner. And that includes making sure that if we happen to be testing any space system, that we are operating it safely and professionally, making sure that it is not going to be causing an undue risk of harmful interference or lack of due regard for the space activities of other countries, as the Outer Space Treaty requires us to do. And we want to make sure that we are consistent with those tenets and then other aspects of national policy. It's been the case for a long time in DoD space policy, in our standing rules of engagement, and I can say that because it's part of the unclassified portion, but that we want to avoid creating long-lived space debris, just as Secretary Austin reaffirmed in his tenets of responsible behavior last year. And then we saw just last week, Vice President Harris making the announcement at Vandenberg Space Force Base that the United States will impose a ban on ourselves on conducting any direct descent missile tests that would potentially strike a satellite and cause long-lived space debris. So it's giving something more concrete, and certainly with tests being part of Starcom's mission in Delta 12, that makes a very clear requirement in the newly announced national policy of types of tests that we will not be doing, because we want to be responsible. We want to send a message to the rest of the world that we consider this type of activity now to be destabilizing and dangerous, just as Russia recently tested its own system that would do these things, with a lot of debris created as a result just last November, and that China did in January of 2007. So we want to make sure that in our efforts to prepare ourselves, that we're not doing things that would pollute the space domain with dangerous debris that could have an adverse impact on our own capabilities and those of allies and those of completely neutral parties that have nothing to do with any potential space conflict. And we want to maintain stability in the space domain.
Excellent, thank you. So I did have a question come in. I've pulled up our Space Force Space Power Doctrine document to kind of get the exact quote here. This is about this being a space law related webinar series. Somebody has asked a question specifically about the legal aspects of the Doctrine document. And so I wanted to read you this quote from the section that this question is asking about. So I'll read you the quote first, and then I'll ask the follow-up question. So the quote comes from chapter 3 of the Space Power Doctrine document, and the quote is this: In keeping with international law, the United States acknowledges that the use of space is for peaceful purposes, while preparing for the reality that space must be defended from those who will seek to undermine our goals in space. The question is, given kind of the content of the Outer Space Treaty itself, is there really an international legal obligation to use outer space for peaceful purposes? And generally speaking, what is the United States Space Forces or Starcom's perspective on that term, right? There's been a lot of controversy over the years, really ever since shortly after the Sputnik launch with respect to this definition, this interpretation of peaceful purposes. How would you interpret or explain the quote from the Space Power Doctrine document, and how does the US Space Force's understanding of that peaceful purposes term, I think, inform this sort of perspective?
Thank you. Great question. So you've all probably heard the maxim, it goes back to Roman times at least, if you want peace, prepare for war. And so that is a big part of what we're doing, preparing capabilities with the hope that we will never have to actually use them in a conflict environment. That is certainly something that underpins a lot of our strategic deterrence capabilities in the nuclear realm. I recall when General Hyten was commander of United States Strategic Command, he would talk about the motto of US Stratcom being that peace is our profession. And then there's a little ellipsis after that to indicate that, hey, we are all about maintaining the peace, but if somebody else tries to breach the peace, tries to attack us, we are going to be ready to respond in a way that they will find completely unacceptable. And so from that standpoint, I would say, yes, absolutely. We want to maintain the use of space for all countries for peaceful purposes. And as a US military, and the United States view is that maintaining the usefulness of space for peaceful purposes is something that our military enables us to do, and that the space capabilities that we have in the military, whether we're talking about satellite communications, missile warning, nuclear detection, space domain awareness, positioning, navigation, and timing, any number of these things that we strongly rely on space for, and we've been doing them since even before the Outer Space Treaty itself was adopted in many cases. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, being able to provide that warning of threats before they become something we can't do anything about, or we suffer an attack. By having military assets in outer space, we are able to better prepare ourselves to deter conflict and to prevail if we do have a conflict. Space is such an important part of the American way of war, whether it's providing worldwide, persistent, near instantaneous communication, so we don't have to go and lay cable out into an austere environment to communicate with each other, or things like positioning, navigation, and timing, both helping our forces to know where they are, potentially to know where other friendly forces or adversary forces may be, having precision guided weaponry that may rely on GPS signals to hit accurately the target, and to do so in a way that causes the minimum amount of collateral damage in order to make sure that we are meeting all of our law of war obligations. There is so much that space does to enable us to, first of all, keep the peace, but then to prevail in war in ways that best meets our requirements under the law of armed conflict. So I would say that there is no conflict whatsoever between having military space capabilities and the goal of having space as a peaceful domain. So far, we have been very fortunate that our capabilities have not been directly attacked with physical damage in the space domain. But our Vice Chief of Space Operations last fall, after the Russian ASAT test, General Thompson, said that we are being attacked in reversible ways every day, through things like jamming of the electromagnetic radio frequency spectrum, through laser dazzling attacks, if you will, things like that, that may not constitute a use of force in all cases, but that are still providing at least a temporary disruption to some of our space capabilities. And we want to make sure that we are able to overcome those as much as possible and to continue to provide the best support that we can to other warfighters in the terrestrial domains, as well as increasingly to make sure that we are developing the means and techniques to be able to defend our assets and our interests in the space domain itself.
Awesome, thank you. I think great response to that question. Very brief follow-up question to the question not related to law. Granting that the space power doctrine document only came out in, I think, early 2020, this person asks, when can we expect to see a new or updated doctrine document? You mentioned, for example, Delta 10. Are they working on updated doctrine documents that we could expect to see sometime soonish, or what would you say to this person, Brian?
Yeah, I'm not aware of current updates in the works to that fundamental space power capstone document, but there are definitely other focused areas where Delta 10 is working on getting things out there. We have a space doctrine publication 7-0, I believe it's already out for command and control, and space doctrine note 3-0 for operations, which is likely to be expanded on. There are some other aspects of our operational doctrine that that we're still trying to make sure we communicate in the best way possible, and that may be expanded into a full new space doctrine publication at some point in the hopefully not too distant future. But yeah, there are other particular publications in the works, and the Space Force continues to be involved in review and commentary on a variety of joint publications that are done for the DoD as a whole, to make sure that that we are accurately reflecting the new state of play with Space Force organizations and command and control responsibilities and other things of that nature, so that we can make sure that we're communicating the appropriate doctrine, the appropriate principles for how we organize and operate in space, and really for making sure that we can then go out and update these things as they become necessary, because it's certainly a dynamic process, the idea of military doctrine development, where you want to be able to state things clearly so that people can kind of move out and use the doctrine in their operations, but then at the same time, as they discover new ways of doing things, come up with new tactics, techniques, and procedures, as new organizational structures come into play and command relationships may change, then of course we're going to go back and update the doctrine to reflect the current operational and organizational reality and what some of the new best practices might be.
So you mentioned the various kind of programs and plans in place to partner with educational institutions, kind of overarchingly for the purpose of this education mission that Starcom has. Next question relates to not folks who are already in the Space Force or the Air Force, or who are, for instance, cadets at the Academy, but rather to ROTC programs at other civilian institutions throughout the country. Granting that Starcom obviously is not a recruitment organization per se, do you guys have any plans or ideas or thoughts about reaching out to not currently military affiliated civilian students, whether through ROTC or through other educational institutions, to educate those students about Space Force, space law, space military operations, and their importance for the United States, with sort of the goal of maybe helping these people decide to join the Space Force or to join ROTC for that purpose? Yeah,
certainly. And the Space Force does already have relationships with and people in a number of different ROTC detachments, as well as junior ROTC at certain high school programs. And we're continuing to increase that. Obviously, the Air Force infrastructure for that is much greater. And so we're relying on that to a certain extent, but also trying to have some Guardian-focused officer accessions. And that's one of the things that the Talent Management Office that is to be set up is also going to be focused on. One of the great things about the Space Force is that it is this cool new thing that people are excited to be a part of. And so I think we have a lot of demand, probably more than we can necessarily fill all the positions for in the recruiting domain and in the sense of people wanting to come into the Space Force, whether from within the military and the other services or from outside. So people want to be guardians, and that's a great thing to have. And so we can be pretty selective about who we take in. I would note that over the past year, the Space Force has begun an inter-service transfer program where we have been taking in a lot of soldiers and sailors and Marines, not only people converting from legacy aft space organizations within the Department of the Air Force, but also from the other services, and bringing their own unique skills and history and military expertise into the Space Force. And so one of the things that I have had the pleasure of doing is teaching the Space Law Unit at our Guardian orientation courses, which are a new course that was stood up last year and going strong every month, bringing in a large number of new inter-service transfers into the Space Force in order to really bulk up our capability and make sure that we have the right Guardians in place to be doing all of these critical missions for the Space Force. So yeah, we definitely have a very active variety of accession pipelines.
Awesome. And a related question, this time not anonymous. This is a question from Major Jessica Torrado. And she asks, anything in the works with respect specifically to training, equipping, or assigning our Air Force JAGs to support Space Force needs?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the great things about the JAG Corps these days is that we are one JAG Corps supporting two services, the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Space Force. So as far as JAG assignments and JAG opportunities to work in space organizations, I think those are only increasing right now. There is not currently any plan to have a dedicated JAG Corps within the Space Force. But as part of the Air Force JAG Corps, we're able to use both all the great experience that we get through the Air Force JAG experience and training, and then often be assigned to Space Force organizations now. So, I've got the name patch or the service patch that says U.S. Air Force, but then my shoulder patches are for the Space Force and Space Training and Readiness Command. So base legal offices continue to exist at Space Force bases, even though they are composed of Air Force members. And so, we've got the 5 designated Space Force bases in the Space Force right now, as well as Los Angeles Air Force Base, which is on its way to becoming a Space Force base. But, we've got Peterson, Schriever, and Buckley here in Colorado, as well as the Air Force Academy, with your role as a space law professor. And then we've got the offices over at Vandenberg in California and Patrick in Florida. So a lot of great locations, frankly, in the Space Force for people to go to and to work at as judge advocates, and to support these missions that are going on. And then, of course, it's not just the base legal offices where you might be more focused on things like legal assistance and military justice, whether your clients or the people you're prosecuting or what have you are, maybe Air Force members or guardians. But there are also definitely space operations focused assignments, and that certainly applies to each of the field command legal offices, such as Starcom JA, where I work, as well as SPOC JA and Space Systems Command. Their legal office down at Los Angeles is, it has some space operations experts assigned to it or coming in soon. And so, as well as the headquarters office at the Pentagon, Air Force JAOS is a place that has some space people assigned to it. So you've definitely got a good variety of opportunities that you can be assigned to as somebody focused on space operations law. And certainly the various pipeline training programs that we have for that, whether at McGill University or the University of Nebraska at Lincoln or the University of Mississippi. We've got some great space law education programs out there that can help Air Force judge advocates to have that really deep background that they need to provide legally informed advice to the commanders and members at all levels in Space Force organizations. So I know at McGill, you get the space law combined with air law. At University of Nebraska Lincoln, you get the space law combined with cyber law. And you can speak better than I could to the program at Ole Miss, but definitely deep dive into space law, certainly. So there are definitely some great opportunities, and it's really fun to apply for that program. And then if you're accepted, get to go and have an Air Force funded assignment as a student where you're in school again, kind of getting to think about big topics from an academic standpoint, but then also looking ahead to how you would be applying these things operationally. So yeah, there are definitely a lot of great assignments and opportunities out there, great learning opportunities within the Air Force JAG Corps, and working in and for or on behalf of the Space Force.
Awesome, thanks, Brian. Now, I know that you have an 0900 meeting. Do you have time for maybe one more question? Follow-up question on, awesome. So follow-up question on Major Torrado's question. I think getting to what you had been saying near the end about kind of the educational opportunities for JAG specifically, this question is, what would be your recommendation, either from a Starcom perspective or maybe just you personally as Major Brian Green, for either a young JAG attorney or even a non-JAG civilian who was interested in kind of breaking into space law? What would be your advice for things to read, things to do? What is the best way to get into this area of law?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think there are a lot of things that you can do, both in terms of reading and writing, and educating yourself as much as possible. Definitely the LLM program is a great way to do that, but if you're not quite at the stage where you're eligible to apply for that yet, or you haven't gotten into it for whatever reason at this point, definitely read a lot, read through the space treaties. They're not that long, and they're pretty easy to get through. And then just really, think about them and read what other people have written about them and how they're interpreted. A lot of things that are in the treaties may have some differences of interpretation, and so you want to be widely read, understand what the arguments for and against any particular assertion might be as to what we're doing or should be doing in outer space. There are definitely a lot of books and articles and things out there that you can go to, and I've done some writing in this area, as you have. So looking at the Air Force Law Review, there have been quite a number of space law related articles in there recently, including ours. And then things like the Lawfire blog that our former DJAG, Charles Dunlap at Duke, runs. And there are just a lot of good resources out there. And then certainly consulting with people like us, like others who have had the space law training and expertise. We're certainly available to do mentoring and provide feedback on something that you might be thinking of writing, or things that can really help to develop our talent within the JAG Corps that's interested in space, to help refine ideas, recognize if there are certain operational considerations that we might not be aware of if we're thinking things from a purely abstract or legal mindset. But certainly talking to space operators, it doesn't have to be space lawyers, but people who are actually doing the job of operating the satellites or the ground stations, maintaining space domain awareness, things like that. I think it's great that you've been doing all these things through the Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Center and making the presentations publicly available. So I'd certainly encourage anybody who hasn't already attended previous webinars here or the US Spacecom Legal Conference that you mentioned from a few weeks ago, to go to the archives and look at these presentations that we've been doing, because there's a lot of value for people, whether they're new to the field or experienced practitioners.